Jack, are any of those notes the thing the podcast is supposed to be about?
I have Pandolo written down here. It's the love child of Han Solo and Poe Dameron.
I don't understand.
Oh, what?
Hello, folks. This is Connor.
Hi, and it's Jack, back after some time.
Yes, and this is Frame to Table, where we're talking about how to be inspired by every movie, from the great ones to the terrible ones. There's plenty of very useful tidbits and pieces of world building or pieces of character interaction that we can take and use in our games of D&D or whatever else. So this podcast is all about exactly that. We watched a movie. Jack, what movie did we watch?
Oh, that's a very good question, Connor. I didn't realize this was a test. We watched The Force Awakens. We thought that'd be a nice introduction. Everybody's seen some Star Wars films, and they're all basically the same. So we're going to have a little bit of a chat about some of the cool Dungeons & Dragons tabletop RPG moments that we found throughout the film.
Right, yes. So I've comprised a list of notes of all my observations. Jack has comprised a list of what it would sound like if each of the Star Wars characters had a kid and they named the kid a mix of their parents' names.
Pandolo is my favorite.
We can perhaps share those at the end. Yeah, we haven't talked too much about the structure. I guess I could begin with, so the Star Wars movies begin with an opening crawl, and that's a little bit unusual for film, but it's pretty usual for a lot of D&D campaigns. It's very common for players to get a copy of like a campaign beginning document from their DM, and I think the big actionable thing we can take from this, like the big piece of advice, is look at what Star Wars does with its opening crawl. It doesn't have a lot about the culture, or it doesn't have a lot about like the characters' motivations. What you learn about in particular is who's doing things, where they are, and what they're doing. And that's a real simple way that if you kept your beginning document that you give your players to talk about what your campaign's going to be about like that, like here are the major players, here's where they are, and here's what they're doing, you'll probably create a document that'll be a lot more successful than one that has all of the cultural paraphernalia that your players will have to trawl through.
Exactly. Players find it a lot easier to interact with characters than they do with cultures and societies a lot of the time. So having a brief document that explains, 200 years of history can be a little difficult for your players to engage with, but having a document that says, here's some people you can go chat to, and here's the action that's going on with them is just lovely.
They don't even necessarily have to be people. Factions work just fine too, I'd say. Like if your document was like, oh, here are the big guilds and what they're all doing, that'd be fine too. It's you want actor, action, and the place where the action's happening. So your players know, like, oh, well, that's that person or faction, and that's what they're doing, and here's where I can go to talk to them. That's just our big takeaway from that one. So we're going to go roughly chronologically through the film, which this isn't a film review podcast, but I quite enjoyed.
Well, me too.
And my spicy hot take is that the movie is totally fine, like pretty good. All the Finn Ray stuff is kind of hard to watch now because, it doesn't go anywhere in episode 9. But, it's...
That's fine. You can watch these films entirely devoid of context. But those films don't actually necessarily support that, because the very first thing that we see as the camera pans down from the crawl onto the planet Jakku is we see one of our characters, Poe Dameron, having a chat with some old fellow in a hut. And there's a very cute little interaction there where Poe speaks, oh, the general will love to hear this, or she'll love to hear this news. And the old fellow goes, oh, to me, she's royalty. And that's a nice nod for the fans, and also a good setup on perspectives, because we know to Poe, Leia is a general, but to this person, Leia was, the princess on Alderaan. So it gives two perspectives on the same matter, and also gives us a context for how the world has changed.
And really importantly for our, the actionable thing here that I really think for our tabletop RPG advice is that the opening crawl doesn't talk about whether Leia is why she's a general now, the transition from princess to general. All that stuff isn't really discussed in the opening crawl, and that kind of thing perhaps shouldn't be in your player document that you're going to have them read, because that's for them to get a nice grounding in the story. Whereas if you really want your players to understand specific details, a really great way to do it is have the people they're talking to have opinions on those details. The person feels compelled to tell Poe that he thinks princess or royalty is a more appropriate term. And so seeding in all of the world building details that you want your players to know into the opinions of the characters they're physically actually talking to in the game is a really good way to communicate information to them.
Yeah, 100%.
There's actually there's another detail later where Ray says a similar thing about the guy who's in charge of the section of the junk planet that she lives on. Basically, her slave owner, Unkar Plot. No, sorry, she's not talking about Unkar Plot. She's talking about like the guy. It's when she rescues BB-8, and she rescues BB-8 from someone who's going to strip him from parts. And she tells BB-8, "Oh, that's this boyo. He has no respect for anyone." Like, it just makes a lot of sense for the people who live together in a town or village to have opinions on each other. And when we hear Ray say that, we learn a lot about her. You know, she's someone who thinks that people should have respect for anyone. And we learn a lot about this guy, that Ray doesn't think he has respect for anyone. And it's just the NPCs and what they're saying to your players are powerful tools, because your players are doing a big thing when they're sitting to the table. They're like forgetting about the world they live in, and they're momentarily inhabiting a new one. And that's like not always an easy thing to do all the time. So we want to make it as easy for them as possible. So having the people they're actually really talking to be the vehicles for information is just clever. It's just good design, good game feel.
So immediately after this little scene with Poe chatting with the older gentleman, we flow into some character introductions. We get introduced to Poe a little more familiarly. Finn is introduced, and so is Kylo Ren. And I think these are some of the best character introductions in media in general.
Whoa, that's pretty extreme opinion. Because you're gonna give that to J.J. Abrams, Jack? J.J. Abrams got the best character introduction in media in general.
You know what? I like Star Trek.
Like, you know, Shakespeare, worthless. You know,
Shakespeare's fine. Shakespeare could use a little more, lens flare. But anyway, these characters are introduced, and instantly it's quite clear that they all stand for something. That there's, some pillar of opinion, of perspective at their core.
Yeah, none of them were sitting down. I didn't notice that until you said it.
But this is something that's really useful for DMs and players alike, where if you can find what's at the center of your character, then it doesn't matter if you're being proactive, going out on adventures yourself, or being reactive and, trying to form opinions on the world around you, invading kingdoms, that sort of thing. If you know what your character is at their core and you express that, often and powerfully, then that leads to really well-defined and really easy to play characters. So for Finn is... the moment he's set down on Jakku, he's sick of the war. Like he looks physically ill. Okay, I know he has a helmet on, but you get that feeling through the acting, He hates it there. He instantly wants to change. We don't need pages and pages of backstory on Finn to know who he is right now and what he intends to do.
And we don't need a soliloquy on him either. As the DM, we don't need to say the words, "Oh," and then Finn takes off his helmet and he says... Like, as the DM, we can just say, he looks visibly uncomfortable. He is shaking around the place. He doesn't want to fix his eyes on anything in this environment.
Exactly. And actually, keeping an eye on the mask acting throughout the film is a really good way of, getting a feel for that. So similarly, when we're introduced to Kylo Ren, Kylo has, this cute little interaction with the old guy, where he just says that he's evil. And he maybe wasn't always evil, but he's definitely evil now, and he will continue to be evil forever. And he's pretty happy with that as things are. I just think that's pretty cool. Star Wars has a really strong opening. It sets the scene really well, starts on a little bit of action, and tells the audience exactly who their characters are to begin with. So you're never really floating around confused. So when those characters start going on adventures and having arcs, it's real easy to see the cogs moving.
Yeah. There's actually two small bits about that scene in particular. I have a lot of notes on this opening, actually, that I really quite enjoyed. So one of the first bits is we see when the First Order is coming on to the desert place and they're massacring the desert village. Desert people don't just run around and be miserable. We see just a couple of scenes of them actively fighting back. And this is something that I think DMs should do a little bit more in game. When the monsters are attacking the village, we tend to have an idea of oh yes, the town guard will protect them, and everyone else will run around screaming, and it can be nice, and it can really help your players care and be more invested in the people that they're supposed to defend if those people are also actively participating and fighting back. And you can take it too far. You don't want a militia of children organizing themselves.
That's a bit much.
But I think it's when you see that scene, you care more about those desert people because they're actively trying to defend themselves. And that's a thing DMs can do it's just a simple, easy trick, have a couple of people fight back when your players are supposed to be defending a group, and the players will probably want to defend them a little bit more. And the second thing is the really interesting, Kylo's establishing character beat is getting shot by a laser pistol, but he just stops it with the Force, where the attack happens and Kylo Ren is just nope, that doesn't actually get to happen. It's not even particularly difficult for me to just say no. And that's a thing that a lot of DMs can take too far. Do you want to talk about that campaign we had where, what I'm aiming at here, right, Jack?
So it's a bit of a pitfall that one could fall into. Your big bad shows up. What's to stop the party from immediately dogpiling onto them and trying to kill them? Because obviously it's the big bad. Why wouldn't I? And you can try and explain to your party, they're level 25. I know 25 isn't even a level in the game, but bear with me here. And you're level 1. Not all parties are going to take that. So it's a pitfall that one could fall into where you want to try and put up some plot armor around the big bad when you're having these interactions with them. You want to say, oh, the big bad shows up and he pauses time, so he can just talk to you and you can only listen. Or he uses his force powers to make sure, actually, no, I know you shot your gun, but it doesn't even hit. You don't even roll a d20. It's not even worth your time, you know? This guy's so far above you right now. And that can be a bit of players don't like, it's not a fun thing to be told you don't have agency in the situation. Like, I understand at the beginning of the game, you don't want, from a narrative point of view, to have your big bad be slaughtered on the battlefield, but it's not always a nice thing to hear, to be told, so trying to avoid that situation as much as possible. Or you can kind of almost see it play out where Finn is like, oh, well, I take out my blaster and I make a shot, and the DM of the movie is like, Kylo just stops time and pauses the shot in midair. He doesn't even get to you. And then the guards run up and they handcuff you, you know?
It's totally valid to have your players run up to obstacles that are out of their level, but you do have to let them try. Like, even if they're going to fail, you have to allow them to run into the brick wall if they want to. Like, you can put the brick wall there, but you can't say, oh, you're not allowed to touch it.
Exactly. And I mean, if you don't want your big bad to slaughter the party in the first act, that's fine. Have them not slaughter the party. If the party wants to start a fight, have a little bit of a fight maybe, and as soon as it becomes clear that the party aren't going to win, you can do something like the big bad says, you know, oh, I'll come back for you later, and then disappears, misty steps away, or something like that. You don't have to always no-sell it. There are ways out.
Also, it's funny there because you said Finn, but you meant Poe, and I think you've accidentally and embarrassingly revealed yourself to be a fake Star Wars fan to the whole internet. How are you going to get a job in all those nerd industries now, Jack?
One of my notes here is, what the heck is a Snoke?
We'll move on. So after this bit, we get the introduction to Rey, right? Do you have any notes on that yourself? I have one or two.
Personally, I like the introduction to Rey. I think it stands similarly by the it has the same core idea of the other introductions, where I feel like we get a really solid idea of who Rey is and that she's just trying to survive in this world. And I think it works really well.
Yeah, there's two things about her introduction that I think are actionable for a DM to take some advice from. One of them is she's introduced scavenging inside a place, and we don't know much about it at first. The shot is all on her, and then we see later that it's a very big place she's in. And then as she leaves, we see it's colossally huge. She's inside a giant Star Destroyer, a huge collapsed spaceship on Jakku. And that sense of scale that really adds something. It adds like a level of history, it adds a level of like time, and it adds like a level of grandiosity to the whole story. And that sense of scale is something that's actually kind of built into D&D. If you have Volo's Guide for the giants, to make sure you impress upon the players how big the giants are. They're so big. I mean, I remember the first campaign we had with John, that first one, like about 2 years ago now. One of in the very first session, you guys encountered some treants, and just how big they were by itself. Like, that sense of scale is an important and powerful tool. If you are tossing like gargantuan monsters at your players, I think something I've seen a little bit often, and something I've probably done a bunch of times myself, is just be like, oh yeah, they're big. You know, they're big boys. Yeah. Like, who cares? But you know, really, if your players are grounded in the world, if you're doing a good job of describing things to them, using all the five senses, making sure they really feel like they're there, then all you need to do to really impress them is have things be big. Like, if you're going to have a temple, especially if you're going to have a giant temple or anything, just have it be like kind of colossal, and that by itself adds quite a level of dignity, I guess, and mysteriousness. So yeah, scale is an important tool, don't forget to use it. And B, there's a cool thing where the village that Rey lives in isn't really just like a normal village. It's got a very peculiar kind of economic system that's a little bit different to the one we're used to, which is just one person has all the food, and you go get something and exchange it for food at rates that he decides. And we see in the film that this dude, Unkar Plot, he gives Rey an amount of food for what she's brought in, and she says, oh, but it was so much more last week. You could really easily imagine, like, especially a village on somewhere more extreme, like a mining colony with no arable land. There might just be a guy who's in charge of all the food, a guy who runs the town, and people exchange the stuff they mine for the food at rates that he determines. It's just an interesting way to do things. It isn't just a typical, like, oh, everyone is farming all the time, kind of feudal England approach. That was just something I saw and I was like, oh, that's an interesting little idea. It's just an interesting situation. I was like, oh, I'm definitely gonna put that one away for later use.
To hold on to, yeah. My next note is actually on the escape scene with Finn and Poe.
Yeah, but that is also where mine is. Oh, and it's the same note. We haven't compared our notes at all.
No, we haven't. This is we're doing it live. So actually, the thing I wanted to talk about, particularly in that, is the thing I really like about the escape scene with Finn and Poe is, so Finn is a stormtrooper, trained there all his life. Poe is a fighter for the Resistance, the best one that they have.
Really? I don't remember the film saying that 9 or 10 times.
But what the DM of the movie does here is really quite clever, in that the DM puts both of them in a situation where they can absolutely shine. The DM says, okay, you're trying to escape an Imperial Star Destroyer, or a First Order Star Destroyer, but thankfully, Finn, you've lived all your life on ships such as these, so you know it like the back of your hand. You can sneak all the way down into the dungeons and rescue Poe. And similarly, then when they come to the escape scene, Poe just has to hijack a
X-Wing? TIE
Fighter.
Millennium Falcon.
And even though he might not necessarily have experience with flying TIE Fighters, he's the best damn pilot in the Resistance, so he's going to be able to fly anything they give him. And it's just, and even from there, they say, particularly the line that I noticed this on, was where Finn jumps into the cockpit and Poe is like, you man the blasters. And Finn's like, oh, how do they work? And Poe's like, oh, they're just like regular blasters. And it's like, that's the DM almost saying, no, you're good at doing this shooting thing. It's where I sort of noticed that the DM has put these characters in a situation where they can absolutely shine, where they get to roll all the high numbers, they get to use their cool features and stuff. And I think that's a great way to open up a campaign, is just setting up a little set piece, a little bit of action or combat where you know your players are going to absolutely destroy the enemy and they're going to get to use all their cool tools to do so.
That actually is an interesting point. I hadn't exactly considered in that scene. I think, I mean, obviously the DMing is a pretty subjective thing. There's lots of different ways to skin that particular Banthanum space cat, but the way that I would interpret that actually is, when I heard you speak, the lesson that I got was DMs often have this desire to not let the players get away with too much, and it makes a lot of sense. We don't want to give our players everything for free. There needs to be a bit of adversity, but it's definitely an impulse that's there. It's kind of difficult to describe and sometimes difficult to work around. In particular, I remember when you were playing Artio in that campaign we ran 2 years ago, there was the scene where you were escaping the Illithid-controlled village, and you were just driving a carriage full of things, and you were doing a thing, and you said, oh, I am proficient in this. I felt very strongly that you weren't. No, you're not proficient in land vehicles. Where would you get that from? I told you that thing about your character that you thought was true wasn't true, because I was like, no, that's just Jack chancing his arm, or he's confused. Carriages are difficult to drive. And no, that doesn't make sense. And that impulse, I think, is a bad one. The impulse to try and like, oh no, I want this to be kind of tricky. I want this to be difficult. I don't want my players to succeed too readily. Whereas if the characters are good at the stuff, you have to let the characters be good at the stuff they're good at. You like actually found the bit where like, no, being a fighter gives me this proficiency. I'm allowed to do this thing. And then later on, you tried to do something in particular. There was some sort of awkwardness happened where one of the carriages flipped on. There was two chained together, and one flipped onto its side and was being dragged along. And you were trying to fix it and get it back. And I was like, no, that's just like not something you have the power to do, even though you were a strength 18 fighter at the time.
I was beefy.
And it's just when Finn gets into the blaster shot, and he's like, oh, I want to shoot. The DM isn't saying, well, actually, those guns are different enough guns you're used to that you're not good at them at all. He's not saying that. The DM is being like, oh yeah, your character is good at guns. Small guns, big guns, guns. And I think that's generally, there are probably some exceptions. It's better to like give your characters the things that they're good at. But the thing that my actual note from this, my original note that I was going to say myself, is the DM makes it suspiciously easy for those two to escape. Like the players don't notice it because it's a tense situation. Like the characters don't notice it because, oh my gosh, it's like they could die at any moment and be tossed into jail. The players don't notice it for a similar reason. As like an audience member or as a GM, you might look at this and say, gosh, there was 2 challenges that they overcame there, and neither of them seemed very difficult. And I thought that was kind of interesting. If you could go easy on them in ways where they don't necessarily need to notice, it felt like a big dramatic moment. And so you actually don't need to have there be so many checks that they have to overcome. When things are high tension and high stakes, the players will feel like they're high stakes, even if you don't actually have them do too many spooky and difficult challenges.
Exactly. It can be kind of tempting sometimes to play to the realism of the situation and make them roll 15 stealth or persuasion checks every time they come across a guard. But just sometimes, just if they're going for a fun idea, let them have it. See where it goes.
There's a thing that I like to do, which is if the players surprise me and they come up with a thing that like I did not expect, I often kind of let that translate over to the people who they are currently against. Like if I'm surprised, I'm like, oh, well, if I'm surprised, surely this person's surprised. They don't know half the things that I do. Yeah, so that's our escape scene. It's quite a delightful scene, and it actually. Do you have any notes about the Finn and Rey on Jakku at all, or?
Not particularly. What I have written here is BB-8 is BB, and that's it.
I see. Right, excellent. I don't know how that's actionable. Everyone put BB-8 in your D&D games. It'll drastically increase.
Fill your game with cute, nice things if you want the game to be cute and nice.
And even if you want the game to be brutal and horrifying, you fill it with cute, nice things.
Yeah, a little juxtaposition helps the blood flow.
So I think this is a thing that DMs can really, really learn from. I mean, one of my favorite bits about this whole movie is that the characters are often really excited for each other. Finn and Poe, as they are escaping the First Order Star Destroyer, they're just delighted with how competent the other person is. Finn in particular is just like, I can't believe I'm this good at shooting a thing I've never shot before. And Poe is like, oh yeah, you're excellent, you're killing it, you're doing a great job. And later on, when Finn meets Rey, they do a daring escape on the Millennium Falcon from two TIE fighters. They both, like, there's a scene where they both meet each other after Rey's done all the piloting, Finn's done all the shooting, and they're both, like, incredibly impressed and delighted with the other. They both, at the same time, say, that was incredible! And it's deeply infectious, and it's impossible not to like them. And so if you're a player, have your character be excited for things that the other characters are doing when they do well. Like, that's a small thing, but we're all playing a game, we're having fun, and it's really infectiously increases the mood. It raises it up hugely when you're just like, oh man, instead of saying, oh yeah, that was a hit. Well, you've done some of what we expected you to do this combat. Be like, excellent, I'm delighted for you. And like have your characters tell the other character they think they're doing a great job. And as a DM, you can have NPCs do that same job. If you're making your players do some sort of escort quest, you can have the whole thing go over a lot nicer if the person being escorted is like, oh my gosh, you guys are so good at this. How did you learn to shoot a bow like that? Is that magic? Wow. Yeah, so that was my thing there. Just be excited. Be like excitable. Smile a lot. Tell people they did a good job. In RPGs and real life, appreciate people whenever you can.
Yeah, that actually flows kind of nicely into the next point I had about when they meet Han Solo and Chewie. They're kind of like, if we're transplanting the game in the movie, we can say that they're like high-level NPCs from previous campaigns or something like that.
Very Gygaxian.
Exactly. But the thing that's particularly nice and very sweet about that moment is Rey is, Rey's a new player. Rey's the level 5, wherever you want to start your campaign at, level 1, engineering, scrappy, rogue type person. And she gets to have really nice engagements with Han. Like, she knows almost as much about how the ship works as Han does. She's able to help him out, fix things like that. And players love this when they come across it in game. If you have like a high-level wizard, your little baby wizard is going to love chatting with them, maybe possibly learning a new spell if they do some cool checks. It's just a really good way of getting your characters engaged, and it's a really good way of having those sort of positive feedback loops where you can chat to the high-level NPC, and if a high-level NPC is impressed with your player, that means a lot to the player.
Actually, I don't know why exactly, but it is really very common in D&D to have the more experienced people very dismissive of your players. Like I remember, in the first game I ever played in, the DM wanted a general to be very important, and we met a general a couple of times, and he was always very much like, oh, well, you did well for what you could, for where you were at. But, it's like you're nowhere near as great as I am. Like, that's a fun character, but if that's all your players are getting, if everyone who is more powerful than them is a dismissive jerk, you're kind of teaching them that when they get more powerful, they should become dismissive jerks.
Yeah.
And yeah, it does impinge on the fun, probably.
Exactly. It can be easy to make that assumption as well, because level 20 characters are basically gods that walk the earth. It's kind of understandable to, their perspective there, but it's not nearly as fun sometimes.
About Han Solo and Chewie, I realized that the movie kind of goes out of its way to do a thing that I would do if I were DMing this whole situation, which is Han Solo isn't just a useful font of advice and wisdom and doesn't just help them out, like getting them in the story, but he gives both Finn and Rey a thing. He gives Finn a blaster and then lets him keep it, and he gives Rey a blaster. And even when she's like, oh, I don't know if I should have this, like, I can take care of myself, he's like, yes, I know you can, that's why I'm giving this to you. That's just like the cheap little psychological thing, but players enjoy getting stuff. If you want them to like and respect a character, it's probably pretty clever to have that character actually give them something mechanical. That's in the most recent campaign that I'm running with you guys, when you guys were in the Fell Tower Inn town, the village around it, and you went into Redmond's trinkets. And Redmond just told you that he appreciated the good fight you were fighting and gave you a bunch of trinkets for free. That's like, you guys then enjoyed and liked Redmond, which came up almost immediately when you touched a possessed evil trinket, a cursed trinket, and his hands turned to horrible, weird spaghetti claws. You were much more likely to want to help him out and go give him that shapeshifter's hands than if he was just a random merchant that you'd never known.
Exactly.
The fact that he'd created some goodwill. So if you're trying to create some goodwill, trying to get the players to like them, don't be afraid to just bribe them.
Exactly.
Actually, there's a couple of set pieces in the movie where you look at it and you're like, oh, that could go directly into D&D. And one of them stirred a pretty controversial memory in me, which is the whole Rathtar scene, which is probably the weakest scene in the movie. A lot of people have had talks about how, like, that's the scene where, oh, I'm going to go refill my popcorn here, because nothing much happens in it, and it's all kind of silly. I quite liked it, but it is, CGI monsters and whichever. The actual environment is pretty interesting. A bunch of tight corridors with a bunch of very powerful monsters seems like an interesting and exciting setup for for a D&D situation. Of course,
it is a definition dungeon.
True. The thing that I'm really remembering is, do you remember the time, Jack, that we had in one of the games that I've run for you, a series of small, tight corridors filled with very powerful monsters?
I actually, right before that was one of the most satisfying moments of my D&D career, in which I did all the calculations necessarily to jump just high enough to hit a flying creature out of the air.
Yes, so you guys had dealt with that. As he died, he was like, oh, you think you are so great, but the Mangler will deal with you. And you guys are like, oh, the Mangler? I'm sure he's spooky. You go into a corridor, and you see at the beginning of the corridor is a massive, in blood, beware the Mangler. You look out, and there's like a tiny walkway with a bunch of pocked holes in the walls. And you're like, oh, how bad can this be? And of course, hands emerge, Koatawa spellcasters who cast Whole Person on you, meaning you're all paralyzed as it's only like a CR5 creature. It's one of like the boys from Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes, one of like the star slashers or whatever, came and completely eviscerated you guys. And I thought that I'd given you guys all ample warning. I didn't make the choice for you to all fail your wisdom saving throws. You know, you all chose to have characters who are thick as bricks. So
this is an example of letting the players run into the brick wall.
I mean, you guys had ample opportunity, and John remembers the whole situation fondly. And eventually the Kurotawa went around on the spell slots. So, I mean, it wasn't so bad.
The opening of your Dungeons & Dragons campaign, like the opening of a movie, is a very important thing to try and get right. It sets the scene for your players. It also sort of sets the social contract. We talk about in one of our videos the idea of the more effort you put into a campaign, the more obvious it becomes to your players that they can put effort into their campaign as well. So if you rock up with some show notes and some like nicely done, maybe character art, maps, that kind of thing, it tells your players that, hey, there's no amount of effort I can put into this and feel silly. So if you have a really strong opening, it sets an excellent vibe for the entire rest of the campaign, and you could go weeks coasting off that goodwill, you know?
I mean, just because the middle of the movie has like less teachable moments for D&D doesn't mean it's like a worse part of the film. It's all wrapped up in character stuff, and there's like, oh, they go to a sprawling vista, but it's difficult to find too much actionable there. It's like, oh, they go to a cool pub, they go to a tavern, and there's a lot of sneaky people in the tavern. There's just not a lot that we could find to give you. So we're like, although we're only really discussed the first third of the movie, we're coming to the end of this podcast, all right? What is your next note chronologically?
My next note chronologically is, that was lucky. Yes, the interactions between Rey and Kylo whilst on the ship.
I want just a tiny bit before that, which is what Matt Colville calls the hologram technique. We see Kylo Ren talk to Snoke. Snoke is a big boy, and Snoke turns the phone call off, and he's not actually so big. He's just a big hologram. And Matt Colville describes as the hologram technique is a way to introduce your big bads to your players in a way where like they can't hurt each other. It's a good way to show, oh, this guy's very powerful, but like you're not going to run into that brick wall just yet. So Matt Colville describes in one of his campaigns like that he was running, the players, they encountered a bunch of bad guys, and the bad guys reported back to a big holographic, spooky big bad. And the wizard was just like, oh, I grow tired of your failure, and remotely cast a death cloud spell, murdering all the people in the room. And the player's like, oh my gosh, this guy is so powerful, he wasn't even here. And then like the hologram, the big bad just disappears. and it sets the scene very powerfully. And like the players, like at no point are you saying, "Oh, you don't have any agency." That's the big problem with the no sell with the Kylo Ren thing earlier, is that restricting your players, saying like, "Oh no, you can't do things," or all the things you do fail. That's like a very different thing to saying, "Oh, like mechanically, look, he's a hologram. He casts the spell, now he's gone."
Yeah. The bad guy isn't here. That's why you can't attack him.
As opposed to just like, you're not allowed to try. Yeah, so that was my note there. What is your... Go on with yours then.
So the thing I just wanted to talk about with the Kylo Ren thing is kind of also the Kylo Ren and Rey thing is also a little bit covered by the Han Solo thing, in that if Kylo's his own character, if he's his own NPC, it's a little bit difficult to think about that because he's, a bad guy fighting against the players. But it's a really good thing to get your players to... Well, not to get them, to allow them to interact on the stuff they think is interesting. So one of the coolest things about the campaign we played a couple of years back, the one with John, as you were talking about, was John's character, Pierre, had a great interest in the Fae and the Fae Wilds and teleporting to the Fae. So he had vast, wild, like, side quests and arcs where he was chatting with, like, the Queen of the Fae on Earth, and he went to a theater and did a performance that teleported his soul to the Fae world, and then a copy of him was teleported back. I'm actually struggling to remember now because it went so deep. But where this shows itself in the movie is Rey and Kylo get to have some time playing with their force powers back and forth. It's always a good idea to just let your players interact with the tools that they are given. So if your rogue knows how to disarm traps, then you might want to put some traps in your campaign. You don't want to necessarily let them waste an ability, or let them feel like an ability is wasted, Similarly, it can be common for characters to go high charisma and never face any interesting persuasion challenges, because those kind of social interactions are difficult to build into the game, but it can be really rewarding for your players if you go the extra mile and try and put that in for them.
There is an interesting thing where sometimes people have a tendency to complain, like, "Oh, the DM wouldn't have put the traps here if you weren't being a rogue." Yes, it's fine that you're here to dismantle them, but if you had just been a fighter, then there wouldn't be any traps here to trip us up anyway. It's an interesting kind of meta problem actually that pops up. I got really into trying to avoid it, where I realized that you guys happen to not have a ranged attack in that campaign with Pierre, RDO, and Ike. Just none of you were any good at ranged at all. And that was something where I was like, "Oh, I definitely I shouldn't only put you against melee things." But it's also kind of rude to have an encounter where it's like, "Oh, yep, everyone is constantly outranged and you guys have absolutely no chance of any sort of success." I began to just not care at all about that kind of composition. I let the dice decide what was going to come up. And that meant that when Pierre decided that he was going to pick up more levels in Warlock and get the Moonbow invocation and get a powerful ranged attack, he knew that it wasn't a useless thing. It wasn't that the DM had been tailoring all of the combat encounters so far around their lack of ranged ability. He knew that ranged foes wouldn't start to pop up now that he had a ranged option, making the situation more complicated to meet his specific capabilities. He was just aware that, "Oh, yep, sometimes I'll need a ranged option, and now I have one." So I think you want to have a full range of all the types of challenges in the game. Your players know that sometimes they'll need to be able to overcome these kind of things. It's a bit poor sportsmanship to, if your players have no rogue, never throw a trap at them.
Exactly, yeah.
Like, sometimes make them say things like, "Oh, I wish I had a rogue." You guys really... There's like a no Arcana caster party happening right now in the campaign that we're running together. Like, it's just sometimes people find a magical item and they're like, "Oh, well, I'll love to identify this the next time I go to a town with a wizard in it."
Yeah.
And that's kind of wild to me, because we've always had someone with Identify up to that point. It's, I can't just have all the items come pre-identified, because that'd be more convenient for you guys.
Exactly.
Oh, that was a slightly more esoteric point than I meant it to be. Hopefully we still have the listeners here with us. My next note was on Han Solo and Kylo Ren's interaction. Kylo Ren murders Han Solo, and Han Solo is a character that the players like, or I guess in our analogy, a NPC that the characters have enjoyed. I said players the first time, didn't I?
I think you just corrected yourself to the thing you said twice.
Whoops. Anyhow, so whenever your players like someone, they won't like the person that kills them. If you want your players to really dislike your villain and want to be motivated against them, have the villain murder people. That's exactly the trick I did at the very beginning of our most recent campaign, where I had the Drag Emperor of Nothing, Althernax the Void Dragon, come and destroy absolutely everyone you'd ever known. And so it's just the four of you left. You're very all personally motivated to deal with him. One of you is even a Vengeance Paladin.
Yeah. This can be a good tool for helping your party. So, murder hobos. happen from time to time. It's just it can be a natural state of the game, you know.
People that might not know what that term means. The way that I take it, it's people who engage with D&D just like a strict game, who are just there for like the mechanical nature of things. So like they go around the place killing things, acquiring treasure, and they want the most XP and treasure, and they don't care at all about having a cohesive character, and they care a lot less about having like fun party interactions. People who are, I mean, D&D's got three tenets, right? It's got exploration, it's got combat, and it's got social. The exploration is the unloved stepchild who even we can't save. Balancing social and the combat is good. It's always good for your game to have more.
Exactly. So it's, if you happen to have a murder hobo character or a set of characters, they're the kind of people who would, you rock up to the shop and the shop wizard comes out and offers you some interesting trinkets at a reasonable price, and the murder hobos go, well, what if we just kill him and steal his stuff? That's a difficult situation to navigate that you might not want to be in all the time. And first thing we always suggest is talking to your players so that you're always on the same ground as to what you're expecting from the game. But another thing to help let people care about the world a little bit is deliver them an NPC that they like. Like an NPC that gives them free stuff, an NPC that, you know, gives them somewhere to live or some cool stories or something like that. And then when the big bad comes up and kills the NPC, it's a bit of a reminder of like, oh, killing people is bad, and we should maybe stick to just killing the bad guys. Because killing good guys, I don't like that. I don't like that feeling.
No, I haven't thought about actually the idea of using the bad guys as technology to try and get a particular set of behavior from your players. Saying, here's what the evil characters do. Don't do that. Because players often kind of, players want to play someone who is liked, but also can do whatever they want. So having like, oh, well, here's the kind of person who does whatever he wants with no consequences. He's evil, Jeremy.
That's the bad guy. The bad guy for everyone.
Yeah, it's a good way to use your villains. Show players what kind of behavior the world doesn't think is acceptable.
Exactly. And nothing, just a side point, you can play a murder hobo campaign if you want. They're great crack. But it's just if you're on a separate page and you want to sort of set some ground rules for the universe.
My final note is actually a cool way to introduce powerful enemies to players early on. It's a hugely asked question, actually. I want to have a dragon encounter my players, but they're only level 3, and like, you know, I don't want to use the baby dragons. That's kind of weird. That's a weird look. I don't want my players to feel weird about slaughtering a baby dragon, but like I want to introduce a dragon to my players and have it not be crazy. And so Kylo Ren is a very, very powerful figure in the movie. He would easily deal with a party, but the DM has a contrivance occur where a big woolly man shoots him with an incredibly powerful gun.
The gun has been stated to be very powerful twice before in the movie.
Explicitly, it's, you know, like, oh, when you get shot by this gun, you fly several dozen meters in the opposite direction. So we see Kylo Ren become very, very badly injured. And that means that in the next fight, he has a lot less HP. He's probably easier to hit than he otherwise would be, and he's not hitting so hard.
He's very slow. He's also after going through a very traumatic experience, so he might not even be operating with all of his features and abilities.
Yeah, and that's one of those things that's easy to justify. If your level 5 players find a young dragon, that young dragon is CR10, unless there's an awful lot of those level 5 players, it's probably going to be more of a slaughter than anything else. But if the dragon has recently been injured, a bigger dragon like ripped one of his wings off and he's all sad, he can't fly properly, his fire attack isn't so good because he's all hurt and injured, it's a good way to like scale things down.
Exactly. That hinges on you communicating to the players effectively that the dragon is in fact injured, because you can't just have a dragon land down and you have hidden behind your DM screen, oh well, actually it's on half HP. If the players don't know that, they're still going to treat it as if it's the full fight. I think the way they communicated that in the movie is really slick, because we talked about the power of the gun for ages. He's not wearing his mask. He's actively bleeding. He's just after a tragic situation. It's super obvious to the players.
There's 2 different bits where he punches his wound in an attempt to feel better about it.
Exactly. The blood on the snow is so vivid and obvious.
No, I definitely agree with that. It's actually that's something that's in D&D proper. You have like, oh, the terrifying beholder. But if you want the fun of the beholder without having like a level 13 monster come and crush your players, you can introduce the zombie beholder, which is a beholder that is a zombie. And so he's a lot less powerful because zombies are slow and stupid. Or there's also the mind witness, the mind flayer illithid converted version of the beholder, which is like CR5, I think. So there's all these like little versions of stuff to be getting on with.
Exactly, yeah.
Like, you know, D&D kind of already has baked in like sometimes unfortunate things happen to the monsters and they're less powerful. sometimes unfortunate things happen to the monsters and they're more powerful, like the Shadow Dragon or the Draco. Those are problems.
You can use those examples in the monster manual to help construct your own, zombie dragon or, tired, sleepy dragon who hasn't had his caffeine shot yet.
Oh, Jack, no, we forgot we were going to do a closing segment and we've totally forgotten what it was.
So we're actually set up a Patreon.
Oh, yes, of course. So obviously this podcast is on YouTube, and that's like a cool thing if it works for you. But we found there doesn't seem to be a way for us to, for free, be setting up a podcast like on any of the podcast RSS, like on the apps or on Spotify. And that service costs like minimum €8 a month. So if you think that you want to hear more of this and you'd want to hear more in like a more convenient location than YouTube, that needs to happen for us to make that viable is we need to get to $8 a month on the Patreon we've just opened. So we'll link it in the video description. It's definitely not required. If this was fine for you and you were only listen to it on YouTube anyway, or if you hated this, or if you're like, well, I mean, these guys are okay, but they're not money okay, that's all fine. But like, if you want this to be more convenient, then we're gonna need at least $8 a month for that to work out for us.
No, we really do enjoy making this kind of content and don't feel at all that you need to pay for it or that you should pay for it. We're having a great blast here, but it's just if looking to have the channel expand in the future, it's the kind of support we would need.
Yeah, in the broader sense as well, we're only together for about 10, 11 more days, and then our lease is up and we're moving out to our different places. And so we only have the one microphone. So we're recording a bunch of episodes. We're batching them all up now. But in the general sense as well, like, I mean, what money wouldn't go to waste. It would immediately be used as like for a microphone, because Jack was stuck home for about a month there. And he wasn't able to come up. And that meant that there wasn't any Jack in any of the videos, which perhaps a lot of you haven't even, like, who is Jack?
Who is Jack?
Many of you might not know.
I'm a mystery now. Oh, you're going to have to watch our backlog. And then the subscriber count plummeted. Viewership through the floor.
Yeah, regardless, that's the... man, I can't believe we just failed to assemble a closing segment. Star Wars is cool. We liked the film. There's lots of cool things to use in it. We should say what movie we're doing next.
Oh, yeah.
Which is going to be 2004 Disney's Robin Hood. Next week. That's what you're getting. Totally different kettle of fish. And if you are in any way a part of the furry community, you've already seen this film and it's had a huge impact on your childhood. We're inside a wonderful little felt prison that we've made for ourselves to try and cancel out as much of the echo as possible.
It's kind of like a tent indoors.
Just as warm.